I stepped into the rooftop restaurant 5 minutes early, my shoes clicking against the polished marble floor, and the city skyline glittered below like a promise I'd stopped believing in years ago. The air smelled of expensive wine and roasted herbs, but there was a sharpness to it, like the place was too perfect to let you relax. I adjusted my tie, feeling the weight of the evening settle into my chest. Tonight was supposed to be special, our 5th anniversary. She texted me yesterday, all cryptic, saying, "Meet me at the Pinnacle, 7 p.m. dress sharp." Big surprise. I'd spent the whole day imagining what she meant. Maybe a private table by the window. Maybe a real conversation, the kind we hadn't had in months. Maybe she'd look at me the way she did when we were younger, before the silences grew longer than our talks. I wanted to believe in that hope, even if it felt like chasing a shadow. The hostess, a young woman with a practiced smile, led me to a long table draped in white linen, already crowded with faces I hadn't expected. My stomach tightened. This wasn't intimate. This was a production. Her parents were there, sitting stiffly, their smiles as thin as the crystal glasses in front of them. Her cousin was there too, lounging back in his chair, grinning like he knew something I didn't. And then I saw her, standing at the far end, laughing with a group of people I barely recognized. She wore a silver dress that caught the light, her hair swept up in a way that made her look untouchable. I stood there, my hands in my pockets, wondering if I should wave or wait for her to notice me. She didn't. Not right away. I felt like a guest at my own anniversary, lingering on the edges of her orbit. The table was set for at least 20, and my seat was at the corner, tucked between her cousin and an empty chair. I sat down, the leather cushion creaking under me, and tried to shake off the unease. The restaurant buzzed with chatter, glasses clinking, waiters gliding past with trays of appetizers. I scanned the room, taking in the details, the flickering candles, the gold-rimmed plates, the way the light bounced off the glass walls. It was beautiful, sure, but it felt cold, like a stage set for someone else's story. Her cousin leaned over, his breath heavy with whiskey, and said, "You clean up nice, man. Didn't think you'd show up looking so respectable." He laughed, loud enough to draw a few glances. I forced a smile, my fingers tapping the tablecloth. "Yeah, well, it's a big night," I said, keeping my voice steady. He smirked and turned away, already distracted by his phone. I looked across the table at her parents. Her mother's eyes flicked toward me, then away, like I was something to be acknowledged but not engaged with. Her father was busy talking to a man in a suit, his voice booming about some business deal. I wondered why they were here. Anniversaries were supposed to be private, weren't they? Just the two of us, maybe a bottle of wine, maybe a chance to remember why we'd promised forever. But this felt like a performance, and I wasn't sure what my role was supposed to be. I shifted in my seat, my hand brushing against the small box in my jacket pocket. It was a gift I'd spent weeks planning, something I thought might mean as much to her as it did to me. I'd been carrying it all day, imagining the moment I'd give it to her, picturing her face softening, her eyes meeting mine. But now, sitting here, I wasn't so sure. She was still at the other end of the table, her laughter sharp and bright, her hands gesturing as she told a story to people who hung on her every word. I watched her, trying to catch her eye, but it was like she was in a different world, one where I was just background noise. The waiter set a basket of bread in front of me, and I took a piece, tearing it apart without eating it. I thought about the last time we'd gone out, just the two of us. It was months ago, maybe a year. She'd spent most of the night checking her phone, answering texts, while I tried to keep the conversation going. I'd told myself it was just a phase, just her being busy, just life getting in the way. But sitting here now, with her parents' tight smiles and her cousin's sideways jabs, I felt the doubt creeping stronger than ever. I glanced at my watch, 7:05. The dinner hadn't even started yet, and I was already tired. I wanted to walk over to her, pull her aside, ask what this was all about. But I didn't. I stayed in my seat, my fingers tracing the edge of the gift in my pocket, telling myself to be patient. She'd planned this, hadn't she? She'd called it a surprise. Maybe I was reading it all wrong. Maybe this was her way of showing she still cared, even if it wasn't the way I'd imagined. I leaned back, forcing myself to breathe, to wait, to trust. The chatter around me grew louder, the lights dimmed slightly, and I kept my eyes on her, hoping for a glance, a nod, anything to tell me I wasn't invisible. But the night stretched on, and I sat there, caught between hope and the sinking feeling that I was the only one still holding on. I sat at the corner of the table, the gift in my pocket feeling heavier with every passing minute, like it was anchoring me to a hope I wasn't sure I could trust anymore. The restaurant hummed around me, waiters weaving through the crowd with plates of grilled shrimp and tiny portions of something green and delicate. I hadn't eaten much, just pushed a few pieces of bread around my plate, my appetite dulled by the noise and the distance between me and her. She was still at the other end, her laughter cutting through the chatter like a melody everyone else seemed to know the words to. I watched her, the way her hands moved when she talked, the way her eyes sparkled under the chandelier light. She was beautiful, always had been, but tonight it felt like she was performing for everyone except me. I reached into my jacket, my fingers brushing the smooth wood of the box I'd brought. Inside was a letter I'd written, words I'd spent nights piecing together, trying to say what I'd never been good at saying out loud. Next to it was paperwork for a trust account, $75,000 I'd scraped together over months, a surprise I'd hoped would show her I was still in this, still dreaming of a future we'd once talked about. A house by the coast, maybe. A trip to places we'd pinned on a map years ago. Something real, something ours. I'd imagined giving it to her tonight, maybe after dessert, when the crowd thinned out and we could have a moment alone. But looking around now, at the packed table and her parents' guarded expressions, I wasn't sure that moment was coming. Her mother sat a few seats away, whispering to a woman in a red dress, her eyes darting toward me every so often, like she was sizing me up and finding me lacking. I caught her gaze once, and she smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind that made you feel like you'd already lost a game you didn't know you were playing. I turned away, my hand still on the box, and thought about the day I'd finished carving it. It was simple, just cedar with a sliding lid, but I'd sanded it until it felt like silk, etched our initials into the bottom where no one would see. It wasn't flashy, not like this place, but it was mine, something I'd made with my hands, something I thought she'd understand. Now, I wasn't so sure. The table erupted in laughter, and I looked up to see her cousin standing, holding his glass high, telling some story about a trip they'd all taken without me. I tried to listen, to smile like I was part of it, but my mind kept drifting back to the letter. I'd written about the early days, when we'd stay up late talking about nothing and everything, when she'd laugh at my bad jokes and rest her head on my shoulder. I'd written about the harder days too, the ones where we barely spoke, where I'd wonder what I was doing wrong. I'd ended it with a promise to keep trying, to keep choosing her, no matter what. I thought it might matter to her, but watching her now, surrounded by people who seemed to know her better than I did, I felt a pang of doubt. What if she didn't want my promises anymore? What if this dinner, this crowd, was her way of telling me something I'd been too stubborn to hear? I took a sip of water, the glass cold against my lips, and tried to push the thought away. I didn't want to believe that. I wanted to believe she'd planned this because she cared, because she remembered what tonight meant. Her father's voice boomed from across the table, pulling me out of my thoughts. He was talking about some deal he'd closed, his hands gesturing like he was conducting an orchestra. I glanced at him, then at her, wondering if she'd look my way, if she'd give me a sign that I wasn't just a prop in this scene. But she didn't. She leaned toward a woman next to her, whispering something that made them both laugh, and I felt the air shift, like the room was hers and I was just passing through. I set the glass down, my fingers lingering on the box again, and told myself to wait. The night was young. There'd be a moment, wouldn't there? A chance to give her the gift, to see her eyes light up, to feel like we were still a team. I held on to that thought, even as her mother's whispers grew louder, even as her cousin's jokes stung a little sharper, even as the space between us felt wider than the table itself. The main course arrived, plates of seared steak and roasted vegetables set down with a flourish, but I barely noticed the food. My eyes were on her, standing now, her glass raised high, the light catching the curve of her smile. The room quieted, heads turning toward her like she was the only thing that mattered. I leaned forward, my hands clasped on the table, expecting something sweet, something about us, about 5 years of marriage, about the life we'd built, flawed as it was. She tapped her glass with a spoon, the chime sharp enough to hush the last murmurs, and I felt a flicker of hope, like maybe this was the surprise she'd promised, the moment where she'd remind me why I'd kept holding on. Her voice was clear, confident, the kind that filled a room without trying. To 5 years of experience, she said, pausing for effect, her eyes sweeping over the table but not landing on me. 5 years of learning, of growing, and now she smiled wider, her teeth gleaming. To being free, single, and searching. The words hit me like a slap, sharp and cold, and for a second, I thought I'd misheard her. Free? Single? My chest tightened, my breath catching as I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, the clarification, anything to make it make sense. Her father let out a loud laugh, clapping his hands like it was the best joke he'd ever heard. Her mother raised her glass, cheering, her eyes glinting with something I couldn't read. Someone else clapped, a sharp sound that echoed in my ears, and then the room fell into a strange, uneven silence, like everyone was waiting to see what I'd do. I didn't move. I couldn't. My hands stayed locked together, my knuckles white, as I watched her lower her glass and reach for something under the table. She pulled out a folded T-shirt, bright white with bold black letters, and slid it across the table toward me, her smile never faltering. I unfolded it slowly, my fingers numb, and held it up. The words stared back at me. 5 years of disappointment. A gasp came from somewhere, maybe her cousin, followed by a nervous giggle from someone else. Then more laughter, scattered, uncertain, like they weren't sure if they were supposed to find it funny. I didn't laugh. I didn't say anything. I just looked at the shirt, the letters blurring as my pulse pounded in my ears. I could feel the eyes on me. Her parents, her cousin, the strangers who'd been invited to witness this. I wanted to stand, to ask her what she meant, to demand why she thought this was okay. But my legs felt heavy, like they were bolted to the floor. I glanced at her, hoping for a crack in her expression, a hint that this was a mistake, a bad joke gone too far. But she was already turning away, sipping her wine, answering a question from the woman next to her like nothing had happened. My throat burned, my mind racing to catch up. Was this the surprise? Had she planned this whole night to tell me she was done, to make it a spectacle? I looked around, at the faces watching me, some curious, some amused, some avoiding my gaze altogether. Her best friend was giggling, covering her mouth like it was all harmless fun. Another guy, someone I vaguely remembered from her college stories, had his phone out, filming, the red light of his camera like a tiny, unblinking eye. I wanted to disappear, to walk out and leave the shirt and the laughter behind, but I couldn't make myself move. The T-shirt lay in my lap now, its weight light but suffocating, and I thought about the gift in my pocket, the letter I'd written, the trust account I'd spent months building for a future I thought we both wanted. It felt like a lifetime ago, like I'd been carrying a dream that was never mine to hold. I stared at the words on the shirt again, each letter carving itself deeper into my chest. Disappointment. Was that what she thought of me? Was that what these 5 years had been to her? I wanted to ask her, to make her say it to my face, but the room felt too loud, too crowded, even in its silence. My hands trembled slightly, and I folded the shirt, tucking it under my plate, out of sight. I didn't know what to do next, didn't know how to be the man who stood up and walked away, or the one who stayed and fought for something that might already be gone. So I just sat there, my eyes fixed on the table, the chatter starting up again around me, the world moving on while I tried to figure out how to breathe through the weight of what she'd just done. The silence in the restaurant felt like a heavy fog, wrapping around me as I sat there, the T-shirt still tucked under my plate, its words burning in my mind like a brand I couldn't shake. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for something, tears, anger, maybe an awkward laugh to play along with the joke that wasn't a joke at all. My chest was tight, my hands cold, but something inside me shifted, like a gear clicking into place after years of grinding. I couldn't just sit here, letting their stares pin me down. I stood up, slow and deliberate, my chair scraping against the floor, and the sound cut through the quiet like a warning. My heart pounded, but my hands were steady as I reached into my jacket pocket, fingers closing around the envelope I'd brought. It wasn't the gift I'd planned to give her, not anymore. That moment was gone, shattered by her toast and the shirt that still lay folded like a confession. I cleared my throat, loud enough to pull the room's attention back to me, and I felt the weight of their gazes shift from pity to curiosity. I didn't look at her, didn't look at her parents or her cousin or the friend who'd giggled like this was all a game. Instead, I turned toward the back of the room, where my uncle and aunt sat, their faces soft with concern, their table tucked away like an afterthought. I started walking, my steps measured, each one feeling like a choice I was making for the first time in years. The envelope was smooth in my hand, its edges worn from how often I'd held it, thinking about what it meant. I'd meant to give it to her, to lay out the trust account, the letter, the hope I'd poured into it. But now it felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who'd never laughed at my dreams or handed me a shirt to wear my failure. The room was so quiet I could hear my own breathing, the faint clink of a fork someone hadn't set down. I stopped at their table, my uncle's eyes meeting mine, steady and kind, my aunt's hands clasped together like she was holding onto something fragile. I didn't smile, didn't try to soften what I was about to do. I brought something tonight, I said, my voice low but clear, carrying further than I expected. Not for the show. Not for the toast. For the people who taught me what commitment really looks like. I held out the envelope, placing it in my uncle's hands, and I saw the confusion in his expression, the way his fingers hesitated before taking it. My aunt's eyes widened, her mouth opening slightly, but she didn't speak. I didn't need her to. I turned back to the room, my gaze sweeping over the table where her parents sat, her father's face blank, her mother's wine glass frozen midair, her cousin leaning forward like he was watching a movie. She was staring at me, her lips parted, her confidence cracked just enough for me to see the uncertainty underneath. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. The envelope wasn't theirs anymore, and neither was I. I walked back to my seat, my shoulders straight, my pulse steady now, like I'd finally exhaled after holding my breath too long. The silence stretched, heavy and thick, until someone coughed, and then the murmurs started, low at first, then louder, like the room was waking up from a spell. I sat down, my hands resting on the table, and I felt lighter, like I'd let go of something I'd been carrying for years without knowing it. The t-shirt was still there, hidden under my plate, but it didn't matter anymore. It wasn't mine to wear. I glanced at my uncle and aunt again, saw them whispering to each other, their heads bent over the envelope, and I knew they'd open it later, away from the lights and the eyes. They'd see the trust account, the $75,000 I'd saved, the letter I'd written not for her but for a future I'd believed in. They'd understand it wasn't about the money. It was about trust, about loyalty, about giving something to people who'd never asked me to prove myself. The waiter came by, refilling glasses, and the chatter grew louder, people pretending nothing had happened. But I could feel the shift, the way her mother's smile was tighter now, the way her father's laugh sounded forced. She didn't look at me again, not directly, but I caught her glancing toward the back table, her fingers tapping her glass like she was trying to figure out what I'd done. I didn't care. For the first time that night, I wasn't waiting for her to notice me, wasn't hoping for a sign that I still mattered. I picked up my fork, took a bite of the steak, and chewed slowly, tasting nothing but the quiet strength settling into my bones. The night wasn't over, but I was done playing a part in her story. The restaurant's chatter started up again, plates clinking, voices overlapping, but it all felt distant, like I was hearing it through a thick glass wall. I sat there, my fork in hand, the steak untouched after that one bite, and my mind slipped away from the table, from the t-shirt, from the envelope I'd just handed over. It went somewhere else, somewhere quieter, where the past 5 years unspooled like a film I hadn't watched in ages. I thought about the first year, when we'd moved into that tiny apartment with the leaky faucet, laughing as we took turns holding a bucket under it during storms. We'd stay up late, eating takeout on the floor, talking about dreams so big they felt possible because we were together. I'd tell her about the book I wanted to write, and she'd listen, her head tilted, her eyes bright, like she believed in me more than I did. But then I saw the other moments, the ones that came later, creeping in slow like cracks in a foundation. The canceled dinners because she had a work event, or a friend's party, or just didn't feel like going out. My birthdays, forgotten or marked with a last-minute card she'd picked up on her way home. The time I told her about my promotion, how I'd worked late nights for months to earn it, and she'd smiled, said, "That's cute," and changed the subject to her own plans. I remembered the way she'd roll her eyes when I mentioned my writing, how she'd call it a hobby, her voice sharp enough to make me stop talking about it altogether. I told myself it was fine, that she was stressed, that we were just in a rough patch. But sitting here now, with the taste of her toast still bitter in my mouth, I saw those moments for what they were, pieces of a truth I'd been too stubborn to face. My eyes drifted to the back of the room, where my uncle and aunt sat, their heads still bent together, the envelope resting between them. I thought about how they'd never missed a holiday, how they'd call just to check in, how they'd sent homemade cookies during the pandemic when we couldn't visit. I remembered the summer we'd bought our house, how our parents had refused to help with the down payment, saying we needed to learn responsibility, but my uncle and aunt had quietly offered half without a second thought. They'd never asked for anything back, never made me feel like I owed them more than a thank you. I could still see my aunt's handwriting on the note that came with those cookies, her words simple but steady. "We're always here, kiddo." I blinked, pulling myself back to the restaurant, the hum of voices louder now, the air thick with perfume and wine. The t-shirt was still under my plate, its weight like a ghost I couldn't ignore. I thought about what it meant, what she'd meant by it. 5 years of disappointment. Had I disappointed her? Maybe I hadn't been enough, hadn't made enough money, hadn't been charming enough at her parties, hadn't kept up with the life she wanted. But then I thought about the nights I'd stayed up, planning that trust account, carving that wooden box, writing that letter I'd never give her now. I tried. I'd poured everything I had into us, even when it felt like I was the only one holding the pieces together. I glanced at her, still at the other end of the table, laughing with someone new, her glass raised like nothing had changed. She hadn't looked at me since I'd given the envelope away, hadn't acknowledged the shift in the room or the way her parents' smiles had faltered. I wondered if she even cared, or if this was all part of her plan, a way to push me out while keeping the spotlight on her. My uncle's face flashed in my mind again, the way he looked at me when I handed him the envelope, surprised, but proud, like he saw something in me I'd forgotten was there. I held on to that, letting it anchor me as the noise of the dinner pressed in. The past 5 years hadn't been all bad, but they'd been lonely, and I was tired of pretending they weren't. I set my fork down, my hands steady now, and let the truth settle in. I wasn't the disappointment here. Not anymore. I left the restaurant late, the city's hum swallowing the echoes of that dinner as I drove home. The t-shirt crumpled in the passenger seat like a relic I didn't know what to do with. The house was dark when I got there, the kind of quiet that feels louder than noise. I dropped my keys on the counter, poured a glass of water, and sank into the couch, my phone lighting up with notifications I didn't want to see. I knew they'd come eventually, but not this fast. I opened the first one, from her, the words sharp and accusing. That was cruel. You embarrassed me. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, but I didn't reply. What was there to say? She'd handed me a t-shirt calling our marriage a failure in front of 20 people, and I was the cruel one? I scrolled to the next message, from her mother. We are devastated. You've always been sensitive. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable, her words twisting everything like I was the one who'd crossed a line. Her father's text was shorter, colder. We should talk. You didn't understand the joke. A joke. That's what they were calling it now. I kept scrolling, my jaw tight, and saw one from her cousin. Bro, what was that? You went nuclear. I tossed the phone onto the cushion next to me, my head leaning back against the couch. Nuclear. Maybe I had. But it didn't feel like an explosion. It felt like finally stepping out of a cage I hadn't realized I was in. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the buzz of their words, but they kept circling, each one a jab meant to pull me back into their version of the story. I didn't want to be there anymore. I picked up the phone again, not to answer them, but to open the photo album I hadn't touched in months. I scrolled past the staged shots, the ones we'd posted online, us at some gala, smiling for the camera, her hand on my arm like we were perfect. I kept going until I found the older ones, the ones nobody saw. Me and my uncle at a barbecue, him flipping burgers, his apron stained with sauce. My aunt teaching me how to knead dough in her kitchen, flour on her cheeks, her laugh louder than the radio. Me sitting on their porch, holding a beer, the sunset turning the sky orange. I stopped on one from 3 years ago, me, my uncle, my aunt, all of us at the lake, my smile real, my shoulders relaxed. I didn't look like a man trying to hold a marriage together. I looked happy. I set the phone down, my chest aching, not from anger but from something softer, something I hadn't let myself feel in a while. Those moments weren't loud or flashy, but they were solid, like roots I'd forgotten I had. I thought about the envelope I'd given them, the trust account, the letter I'd written for a future that wasn't hers anymore. I wondered if they'd opened it yet, if they'd read the words I'd meant for someone else but given to them instead. I didn't regret it. They deserved it more than anyone at that table. The phone buzzed again, another message, but I didn't look. I didn't need to. Their words were just noise now, trying to drown out the truth I was finally hearing. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and poured the water out, the glass cold against my palm. I thought about tomorrow, about what came next, but for once, I didn't feel like I had to have all the answers. I'd done something tonight, something that wasn't about her or her parents or the crowd. It was about me, about the people who'd never asked me to be anything but myself. I went back to the couch, picked up the t-shirt, and held it for a moment, its fabric soft but heavy with everything it meant. Then I walked to the trash can and dropped it in, the lid closing with a quiet thud. I didn't need it anymore. The morning light slipped through the blinds, casting thin stripes across my apartment floor, and I sat at the kitchen table, my coffee gone cold while I stared at my phone. It had been buzzing nonstop since last night, notifications piling up like debris from a storm I didn't start. I hadn't answered any of them, not her texts, not her parents, not the vague apologies from people who'd clapped at her toast. I didn't want their words cluttering my head. But then I saw a new email, not from her or her family, but from my aunt, forwarded with a note that made my stomach twist. It was a message from her, sent to my uncle and aunt, accusing them of turning me against her, of poisoning our marriage with their meddling. Her words were sharp, polished, like she'd spent hours crafting them to cut deep without sounding desperate. I read it twice, my jaw tight, each sentence sinking heavier than the last. She'd written about loyalty, about family, about how they betrayed her by accepting the envelope, as if I'd given it to them despite her. I set the phone down, my hands flat on the table, and took a slow breath, trying to keep the anger from boiling over. They didn't deserve this. They'd never asked to be dragged into her story, never done anything but show up for me when I needed them most. I thought about calling them, telling them to ignore it, but then my phone rang, and my aunt's name lit up the screen. Her voice was soft when I answered, but it shook, like she was holding back tears. "We don't want to be the reason your marriage ends," she said, each word careful, like she was afraid of breaking something fragile. I closed my eyes, picturing her in their kitchen, probably twisting a dish towel in her hands the way she did when she was upset. "You're not," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You're the reason I remembered who I am." There was a pause, then a small laugh, the kind that comes when someone's been carrying a weight and finally sets it down. We talked for a while, not about the email, but about little things, her garden, my uncle's new fishing rod, the way the leaves were turning early this year. It felt good, like slipping into a warm coat after standing in the cold too long. When I hung up, I opened my laptop and saw what I'd been avoiding. Her latest post online, a carousel of photos from the dinner. There she was, hugging her parents, her smile bright, the caption reading, "Love is what stays silent through the storm." The comments were a flood of support, people saying she deserved better, that some men couldn't handle strong women, that she was brave for speaking her truth. I scrolled through them, my chest tight, not because I cared what strangers thought, but because it was so calculated, so perfectly her. She turned the night into a narrative where she was the hero, and I was the shadow that faded out. I closed the laptop, my fingers lingering on the lid, and thought about the t-shirt in the trash, the envelope I'd given away, the way her parents had laughed when she'd raised her glass. I could have posted something too, could have told my side, but what would that do? It wouldn't change the dinner, wouldn't erase the years of quiet neglect, wouldn't make her see me differently. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the street below, where people moved through their morning routines, walking dogs, carrying coffee, living lives that didn't feel like performances. I envied them, just for a moment, but then I thought about my aunt's voice, my uncle's steady gaze when I'd handed him the envelope. They hadn't needed me to explain myself, hadn't asked me to justify what I'd done. They'd just taken it, held it, like it was enough. I went back to the table, picked up my phone, and deleted the email without replying. I didn't need to defend them or myself to her. She'd made her move, and I'd made mine. The coffee was still cold, but I drank it anyway, the bitter taste grounding me as I thought about what came next. I didn't have a plan, not really, but I had something better, a sense of myself I hadn't felt in years. I opened a notebook, one I used to scribble ideas for the book I'd stopped writing, and started jotting down thoughts, not about her, but about me, about what I wanted, about the life I could build without waiting for her to approve it. The pen moved fast, the words messy but honest, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was running out of time. The doorbell rang on a Tuesday afternoon, sharp and unexpected, pulling me away from the dishes I'd been scrubbing in the sink. I dried my hands, my pulse ticking up, because nobody showed up unannounced anymore. I opened the door, and there she was, standing on the steps of my apartment, her coat pulled tight against the November chill, her hair catching the gray light like it always did. I hadn't seen her since the dinner, hadn't heard her voice except in texts that blamed me for everything. "Hey," she said, her smile small, the kind she used when she wanted something. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside, not because I wanted to, but because I was curious, because I needed to know what this was. She walked past me, her perfume trailing, and I closed the door, the click loud in the quiet. My place was small, just a one-bedroom with second-hand furniture, but it was mine, and having her here felt like an invasion. She stood in the living room, glancing at the books on my shelf, the notebook open on the coffee table, like she was looking for clues to who I'd become. "It's cozy," she said, her voice light, but I didn't answer. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed, waiting. She turned to me, her expression softening, and said, "Look, about the dinner, it was a bad joke. I got carried away. You're overreacting, though. You always do." Her words were smooth, practiced, like she'd rehearsed them in the car. I didn't move, didn't nod, just watched her, letting the silence stretch until it felt heavy. She shifted, her smile faltering, and I walked to the closet, my steps slow, deliberate. I pulled out the t-shirt, still folded, though I'd taken it out of the trash days ago, not sure why I'd kept it. I held it up, the words 5 years of disappointment stark against the white fabric. You gave me this, I said, my voice low, steady, on our 5th anniversary. Did you even read it out loud to yourself before you decided it was funny? Her eyes flicked to the shirt, then back to me, and she laughed, a short, sharp sound that didn't reach her face. Come on, it's just a shirt. You're not seriously divorcing me over a piece of cloth, are you? I lowered the shirt, folding it again, not because I cared about it, but because I needed something to do with my hands. I looked at her, really looked, and saw the way she stood, shoulders back, chin up, like she was ready to talk her way out of anything. But I wasn't the same man who'd sat at that table, waiting for her to notice me. No, I said, meeting her eyes. I'm leaving because I finally believe what you printed on it. Her mouth opened, then closed, like she'd expected me to fold, to apologize, to beg for another chance. I didn't. I set the shirt on the counter, my hand steady, and leaned back, letting her see I wasn't angry, wasn't hurt, just done. She started talking again, faster now, about how we could work it out, how I was blowing this out of proportion, how her parents were upset but willing to talk. I listened, but it was like hearing a song I used to know, one that didn't mean anything anymore. I thought about my uncle and aunt, about the envelope, about the notebook on my table where I'd started writing again, not for her but for me. She kept going, her voice rising, but I cut her off, gentle but firm. You should go, I said. She stopped, her eyes narrowing, and for a moment, I thought she'd argue, but then she grabbed her coat, her movement sharp, and walked out, the door slamming behind her. I stood there, the silence settling like dust, and felt a quiet relief, like I'd finally closed a book I'd been trying to finish for too long. I sat at my desk, the lamp casting a warm glow over the blank page in front of me, my pen resting against my fingers like an old friend I'd forgotten how to trust. It was late, the kind of quiet where every sound feels sharper, the creak of the chair, the hum of the fridge, the faint patter of rain outside. I'd been thinking about writing something for weeks, not the book I'd started years ago, but something new, something final. A letter. Not to hurt her, not to explain myself, but to close a door I'd left open too long. I started slow, the words coming careful and clear, like laying stones for a path I'd walk only once. I wrote that I didn't want contact, that I wasn't interested in her version of the story, that I wasn't coming back. It wasn't bitter, just honest, each sentence a step away from the man who'd sat at that rooftop table, hoping for a glance that never came. When I finished, I folded the paper, slipped it into an envelope, and sealed it, my hands steady, my breathing even. I'd mail it tomorrow, not as a threat, but as a period at the end of a sentence I'd been rewriting for years. The next day, I got a call from my aunt, her voice tight, saying her parents had reached out, asking my uncle and aunt to return the money from the trust account, claiming it was a misunderstanding. I could hear my uncle in the background, his tone calm but firm, saying they didn't want trouble, but they weren't giving anything back. I told my aunt I'd cover any legal fees if it came to that they shouldn't worry, but my uncle got on the phone and said, "You don't owe us. You never did." His words hit me harder than I expected, not because they were new, but because they were true, and I was finally starting to believe them. We made plans for Thanksgiving, just the 3 of us, and when I hung up, I felt lighter, like I'd been carrying a weight I didn't need anymore. The weeks passed, and the holiday came, the air crisp with autumn, the table at their house covered in dishes that smelled like my childhood, roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, my aunt's pecan pie. We talked and laughed, the kind of laughter that doesn't need an audience, and there were no awkward silences, no need to pretend everything was fine. I told them about the letter, about how I'd mailed it without expecting a reply, and my aunt reached across the table, squeezing my hand, her eyes soft but proud. My uncle raised his glass, not for a toast, but just to say, "You're doing all right, kid." I smiled, the warmth of the moment settling into me like a promise I could keep. Later, as we cleared the plates, my aunt mentioned she'd hired a lawyer, just to be safe, in case her parents pushed harder about the money. I offered to help again, but she waved me off, saying they had it handled, that it wasn't my fight. I nodded, knowing she was right, but feeling a quiet strength in being there for them the way they'd always been for me. We finished the night with coffee, the conversation drifting to small things, my writing, their plans for a winter trip, the way the stars looked clearer out here than in the city. I drove home under that same sky, the letter long gone from my mind, its weight replaced by something new, something solid. I didn't need her to read it, didn't need her to agree or apologize. I'd written it for me, to mark the end of waiting, the end of hoping for a version of her that didn't exist. When I got back to my apartment, I sat at my desk again, the lamp still warm, and opened my notebook, not to write another letter, but to start something else. Maybe a story, maybe a piece of the book I'd put down too long ago. The pen felt good in my hand, the page empty but not intimidating, and I knew, whatever came next, it would be mine. I stood in the bookstore, the smell of fresh paper and coffee wrapping around me like a quiet welcome, and my fingers brushed the spine of my novel on the shelf. Its cover simple but bold, the title inked in a font that felt like it belonged to me. It had been a year since that rooftop dinner, a year since I'd walked away from her toast and her t-shirt, and now here I was, staring at something I'd built from the pieces of myself I'd almost forgotten. The store was busy, people weaving through the aisles, their voices a soft hum, but I felt alone in the best way, like this moment was mine to hold. I pulled the book down, my thumb tracing the dedication on the first page, for the people who never needed me to perform, just to show up. I smiled, thinking of my uncle and aunt, of the way they'd cheered when I told them it was done, their voices crackling through the phone like they were right there with me. I slipped my phone out, snapped a quick photo of the book on the shelf, and sent it to my aunt, knowing she'd flood me with emojis before she even typed a word. Sure enough, a minute later, a string of hearts and thumbs-ups lit up my screen, followed by a single line. "We're so proud, kiddo." I tucked the phone away, my chest warm, and let myself linger, watching strangers pass by, wondering if one of them might pick up my story, might carry it home, might find something in it that felt true. I'd spent months writing it, late nights at my desk, the lamp casting shadows as I poured out everything, the doubts, the hopes, the quiet moments that had kept me going. It wasn't about her, not really, though I'd be lying if I said those years didn't shape it. It was about finding your way back to yourself when the world tries to tell you who you're supposed to be. I left the store, the evening air cool against my face, and drove to my uncle and aunt's place, the road familiar now, each turn a reminder of how often I'd made this trip over the past year. Their house glowed from the porch, the light spilling out like an invitation, and I parked, grabbing the bottle of cider I'd brought from the back seat. My uncle opened the door before I could knock, his grin wide, his flannel shirt untucked like always. "The author arrives," he said, clapping my shoulder, and I laughed, shaking my head as I stepped inside. The kitchen smelled of apples and cinnamon, my aunt bustling at the counter, her apron dusted with flour. She hugged me tight, like she hadn't seen me in months, even though I'd been over just last week. We settled on the porch later, the three of us, mugs of hot cider steaming in our hands, the stars sharp against the black sky. The night was quiet, just the rustle of leaves and the occasional creak of the porch swing, and I felt a peace I hadn't known I was looking for. My uncle leaned back, his mug resting on his knee, and asked, "Do you ever regret how public it was?" "That night, I mean." His voice was soft, not pushing, just wondering, and I took a sip of cider, letting the question settle. I thought about the dinner, the way her words had cut through the room, the way I'd stood up and chosen something different. I thought about the texts that followed, the posts online, the way her family had tried to rewrite it all. "Sometimes," I said, my eyes on the stars. It wasn't pretty, standing up like that, handing over the envelope in front of everyone. I could have done it quieter, maybe. But then I remember, I didn't cause the silence. I just stopped filling it. He nodded, slow and thoughtful, like he'd been carrying the same question and my answer was enough. My aunt reached over, squeezing my arm, her touch steady, and we sat there, the night wrapping around us, no need for more words. I thought about the past year, how I'd moved into my apartment, started writing again, found a rhythm that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. I'd seen her posts now and then, glimpses of her life online, new trips, new friends, the same bright smile, but they didn't pull at me anymore. I didn't check for them, didn't wonder what she was saying about me. I'd mailed that letter months ago, and whether she'd read it or not, it had done what I needed, closed a chapter, let me start a new one. I leaned back in my chair, the cider warm in my hands, and thought about the book, about the dedication, about the people sitting next to me. They'd been there through it all, not asking me to be anything but myself, not needing me to prove I was worth their time. I remembered the holidays we'd spent together, the calls just to talk, the way my uncle had helped me move a couch into my place, grumbling about his back but laughing the whole time. I remembered my aunt's pies, her stories, the way she'd listen when I talked about my writing, her questions sharp but kind, pushing me to keep going. They were my anchor, not because they'd saved me, but because they'd reminded me I could save myself. The stars seemed brighter now, or maybe I was just seeing them clearer, and I felt a quiet certainty, like I'd finally found my place, not in a bookstore or a dedication, but right here, in this moment, with people who knew me without needing a script. I didn't think about what I could have done differently, didn't replay the dinner or her toast or the years of trying to be enough. I just sat there, the night soft around me, and let myself be. My uncle started talking about a fishing trip he was planning, his voice low and easy, and I listened, nodding, adding a comment here and there, the conversation flowing like a river I didn't have to steer. My aunt chimed in, teasing him about the fish he'd never catch, and we laughed, the sound carrying out into the dark. I took another sip of cider, the warmth spreading through me, and knew this was what I'd been working toward, not a big ending, not a triumph, just a life that felt like mine. The book was out there now, a piece of me on those shelves, but it wasn't the whole story. The real story was here, in the quiet nights, the shared drinks, the people who stayed without being asked. I looked at the sky again, the stars steady, unchanging, and for the first time in 5 years, I wasn't searching for something I'd lost. I was just living, and that was enough.